Mrs. Johnston, welcome back. We are working on knowledge and social studies. We are on Unit 10, Colonial Towns and Townspeople. Before we begin today's read aloud, let's review what we have already learned. You have learned about 4 tradespeople who made garments for customers who came to their shops in town during colonial times. Let's review those 4 tradespeople. We had the dressmaker, the tailor, the hatter, and the cobbler. Let's discuss each one of those tradespeople in a little bit more depth. The dressmaker. Who can tell me some things that the dressmaker was responsible for? Did you say that the dressmaker was responsible for measuring women and making clothing for women, and that clothing took a long time? Some things that they would have used to make the clothing was patterns, scissors, thread and needles, cloth. The next person is a tailor. The tailor also made clothing for women, but also for men. And those items that he would have used for making clothes would have been the same as a dressmaker: a tape measure, thread, needle. The next person that we are going to talk about was the hatter. And the hatter was responsible for making hats for men or bonnets for women. Those items were made out of beaver skin, wool, or camel fur. And the hatter also used an item of glue that he had to make on his own. The last tradesperson we learned about was the cobbler or the shoemaker, and that shoes were very hard to make and they were expensive. So many times people would have the shoes they already have repaired, but the cobbler would use tools, specialized tools, and leather or skin from a cow to make or repair shoes. Shoes today are usually made in factories who specialize in running the machines and make the shoes. When we go to the shoe store, sales clerks, people who specialize in helping customers, are there to help us. Towns from long ago, many tradespeople had to make their products in their shops as well as sell their products in their shops. A cobbler may be very good at making shoes, but may not be very good at deciding what style shoes to make in order to interest his customers in buying those. Let's Think about this question. What is the name of the tradesperson who made shoes? Did you remember and say a cobbler? Today's story is called The Elves and the Shoemaker. You are going to hear a fictional story about a once successful shoemaker who became poor. Listen carefully to find out how the shoemaker once again became successful and who helped him. Once there was a shoemaker who had grown very poor over the course of several years. He didn't have much money. The shoemaker had been good at his trade. He made attractive or pretty or handsome shoes that fit well and made his customers happy. But unfortunately, fashions had changed over time, and the shoemaker's shoes had gone out of style. People didn't want to buy them anymore. They preferred the shoes that the shoemaker in the next town made. The shoemaker looked around at his shop, which was in the front of his house. He had very few supplies left to make new shoes. Since people had stopped buying his shoes, he wasn't making any money. Because he wasn't making any money, he wasn't able to buy new supplies. He picked up the tiny bit of leather that he had left. He thought perhaps he would be able to squeak out one last pair of shoes before he closed his shop for good and moved to the poorhouse with his wife. People who couldn't afford their own house lived together in a place called the poorhouse. He carefully cut out the pieces he needed and set them at his work table, but he was too tired to work, so he yawned, kissed his wife good night, and went to bed. What do you think will happen to the poor shoemaker? He will decide to not make the shoes. The shoes he makes will not sell, and he will still be poor. Those were all great responses that you said. The next morning, he rubbed his eyes, kissed his wife good morning, and went directly to his shop to work on the last pair of shoes. When he entered his shop, he stopped short. He rubbed his eyes again. There, on his work table, where he'd left the pieces of shoe leather the night before, was a perfectly assembled pair of shoes. Wow! Where do you think the finished shoes came from? Did you say his wife? Or maybe another shoemaker? Let's see if the story tells us. The shoemaker picked up a shoe. The stitching was neat and attractive. The shoe was more stylish and interesting than the shoes the shoemaker himself made. But where on earth had the shoes come from? Who had made them? The shoemaker had no idea. The shoemaker asked his wife, but she also had no idea. Not knowing what else to do, the shoemaker picked up the shoes and placed them in the front of his window. Just then, a gentleman walked by. He stopped at the window and peered in. He quickly opened the door and pointed to the new shoes. I simply must have those shoes. What will you take for them? The shoemaker shrugged and gave his normal price. The man waved his arms excitedly. No, 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 no. Those shoes are worth twice that much. He insisted that the shoemaker take double his normal price for the new shoes. The shoemaker accepted the money graciously or with thanks. As soon as the man walked out of the shop, the shoemaker clicked his heels, kissed his wife, and ran out the door to go to the leather shop. With the money he'd just been paid, he was able to buy enough leather for 2 new pairs of shoes. Later that day, the shoemaker cut out the pieces to make 2 new pairs of shoes. But he was tired, so he yawned, kissed his wife goodnight, and went to bed. In the morning, the shoemaker found 2 new pairs of shoes, just like the pair he'd found the day before. The stitching on both pairs was just as neat and attractive as the stitching on the previous pair, and the style was just as interesting. He put the 2 new pairs in the front window and was pleased when 2 men walked in within minutes and offered double the normal price for the 2 pairs of shoes. The shoemaker clicked his heels, kissed his wife, and ran to the leather shop. He bought enough leather to make 4 new pairs of shoes. Again, he cut out the leather and went to bed. What do you think will happen? Did you say that the shoemaker's going to wake up and have more shoes made? Let's see if you were right. And in the morning, he found 4 new pairs of shoes. Were your predictions correct? Again, the shoes sold quickly for double the shoemaker's normal price. And again, the shoemaker clicked his heels, kissed his wife, and ran to the leather shop to buy more leather. This went on until the shoemaker had sold so many pairs of shoes that he became a very rich man. Now he had a lot of money. One evening, just as he was about to kiss his wife goodnight, he suggested to her that they stay up and find out who was responsible for making all these shoes that had made them so rich. His wife thought that was a good idea, so the two of them hid in a corner of the shop and struggled to stay awake. What or who do you predict that they will see? Did you predict that they might see a young boy who was trying to become a tradesperson as a shoemaker coming into the shop to make shoes? Did you predict magic is happening, that magic is making the shoes? Let's see if we can find out. At about midnight, they saw 2 little elves enter the shop. Elves are small, magical characters or fairies The elves were wearing old, worn out clothes with holes in the elbows and knees. They went straight to the leather and began to work, stitching together shoe after shoe after shoe. When they were done, they lined up the shoes up neatly into pairs and then quietly left the shop. Is this what you predicted? The shoemaker and his wife were very surprised. Who would have imagined that two little elves could make such stylish shoes? The shoemaker said. Yes, said his wife, and yet they have no shoes of their own, nor do they have decent clothes. I would like to make them each a new set of clothes. It is the least we can do for all they have done for us. That is a nice idea, said the shoemaker. So the shoemaker's wife worked all day. She made two little shirts and two little pairs of trousers or pants. She made two little pairs of suspenders and two little pairs of socks and two little pairs of shoes. The little shoes looked exactly like the little versions of the stylish shoes that the elves themselves made. That night, the shoemaker and his wife laid out the new sets of clothes in the place where they usually set out the shoe leather. They hid in the corner to watch how their little elf friends would react when they saw their presents. How do you think the elves will react? Did you say the elves will be happy, excited, curious? Those are all great responses. Let's see if we find out how the elves feel. At midnight, the two elves entered the shop. They saw their new clothes and looked thrilled to pieces. Do you think thrilled means really happy or really sad? Did you say really happy? They quickly put on everything. Then they danced together. We are two fine or fancy little gentlemen now, said one elf. Why, yes, we are, said the other. We are so fine that we could never think of working as a shoemaker ever again. They joined arms and skipped out of the shoemaker's shop. The shoemaker and his wife never saw the elves again, but by this time they had grown very rich and never had to make shoes again, and so they lived happily ever after. Who are the main characters in the story? Did you respond and say the shoemaker, his wife, and the elves? What is the setting of this story, or where does it take place? Did you say the shoemaker's shop? What materials does the shoemaker use to make his shoes? Did you say leather? The shoemaker leaves his last scrap of leather on his work table before going to bed one night. What does he find on his work table when he wakes up? He finds a pair of stylish shoes. Why had the once successful shoemaker become poor? He wasn't making the style or kind of shoes people liked, so they stopped buying his shoes. What does the shoemaker's wife do for the elves? She makes new clothes and shoes for them because their clothes are worn and they don't have shoes. Why do you think she does this? She wants to thank them for their help. Why do the elves stop making the shoes? They think they look like fine gentlemen who don't need to work. Mrs. Johnston hopes you enjoyed our story today called The Elves and the Shoemaker.